FedRAMP's new vulnerability rules are going to expose a gap in a lot of cloud security programs. And the gap is not whether your scanner can find vulnerabilities, because your scanner very likely can. The real question is whether your organization can understand which vulnerabilities matter, why they matter, what impact they could have on federal customers, what response timeline applies, and whether the decision you made is visible and defensible. That is what FedRAMP is moving toward with vulnerability detection and response, or VDR, and vulnerability evaluation and reporting, or VER. Welcome back to the 38 North Security Podcast. I am Ingrid Velasquez-Woodley, Senior Director of Revenue Strategy here at 38 North Security. Joining me today is Sam Leestma, our Vice President of Solutions Engineering.
Hey, everybody.
Hey, and we also have Spence Witten, our Principal of Cybersecurity Consulting. Hey, Spence.
Hey, everybody.
All right, so very exciting because 38 North has just launched Northwatch, and that includes a VDR capability. So today we want to talk about the problem that, or one of the problems that it was built to solve, and that is why VDR is more than just better scanning, and why context is the hard part, why existing Rev 5 providers need to pay attention now, and what it actually takes to make vulnerability decisions visible, timely, and defensible under the new FedRAMP model. So Sam, let's start there. A lot of the market conversation around VDR right now is still focused on saying that scanning more often or reporting faster or both or automating the dashboard is what VDR is all about. Why is that an incomplete way to think about it?
Yeah, I think the answer lies really in VER. It's the evaluation, right? And in order to evaluate vulnerabilities correctly within the security context of your system, their impact to agencies, you really have to know a lot about your system. You have to have a lot of telemetry. You have to know where vulnerabilities sit, what kind of protections you have around there, how that affects some of those attributes of the vulnerability, and it's not trivial. It's really the ability to take all of this data from all these different sources and collect it in one place, and then build that story around how that affects the different aspects of a vulnerability. So that evaluation piece is key. The increased scanning is good, and the VDR standard of discovery is fine, and that helps with the amount of or it decreases the amount of time in between scans. You're getting new data, but without the context, it doesn't mean anything. Raw scan results do not allow you to actually respond appropriately to prioritize and categorize vulnerabilities, and it doesn't give your customers the assurance that what can actually impact their data and their systems.
Spence, when we say VDR requires context, what are we actually talking about?
We're talking about a process that really has to be automatic, right? So, like Sam said, we don't really care so much about vulnerabilities anymore. We care about whether or not a vulnerability exists on an asset that has relevant data and is itself publicly accessible and exploitable, right? Which is really the way we should think about vulnerabilities. So if I was a CISO, right? God forbid I am not a CISO. Nobody ever hired me for that role. If I were a CISO though, and I had a stack of vulnerabilities, I would really want to know, okay, well, where does this vulnerability live? What data is exposed to this vulnerability? How exploitable is this vulnerability, and how publicly accessible? And that's how I want to prioritize. I don't necessarily want to prioritize on an arbitrary high, medium, and low CVSS score, which we've kind of lost confidence in over the last couple of years. And so I think what both VDR and VER together, and I think you have to look at them together. And I think a lot of us that have been watching 20X from the beginning are kind of going to forget the VER part because they kind of stuck VER on towards the end, and we're just going to talk about VDR. But really, you got to consider them together. What you need to do is you need to have an automated mechanism for tagging vulnerabilities as they come in. You're no longer going to be able to just look at a vulnerability score, and you're certainly not going to be able to do this manually one by one, like trying to figure out where things are. You need processing logic as vulnerability scans come out that give you this context and sort of rescore vulnerabilities on the fly. And I see a lot of people trying to do this manually, and it's not going to work. I mean, even for a small organization, you might have 300-400 findings that pop out on a recurring basis, and we all scan most of the time real time now. So deconflicting those scan results, normalizing them, and then going through them line by line to try to do this manually just isn't a viable solution.
I like what he said in our past episode about how you're never going to resolve all of your findings. There's just too many. And the game now is all about prioritizing them.
Yeah, you're certainly not going to resolve them all fast, right? So like in an old days where we might have said a vulnerability was a high and we needed to get it all fixed within 30 days everywhere it existed in an organization. Now with the volume of vulnerabilities we're seeing, it's not, hey, I'm going to try to fix everything within 30 days. It's, I'm going to try to fix this subset immediately, and I'm going to try to fix this subset on a slightly different timetable. And then this other set, like I'm not going to leave them there. I understand they're important, but they're going to have a different timeline. And FedRAMP 20x is kind of getting a little bit of grief online because it's gotten complicated, their pain ratings and where a vulnerability sits and how many days. I can't just sit there and say, 30, 90, 180 like I used to be able to, and it's nice and easy. But sometimes complexity is better, right? And this is a more realistic way of looking at vulnerabilities. And yeah, like we can fix everything over a long enough period of time, but like I need to fix these things now, and that's what this pushes us to do.
And I just want to jump in there real quick. And I think it's important to understand, why as well, right? I mean, the threat landscape is very different than it was 10 years ago, with AI, automation of attacks, all sorts of things out there, the speed at which they can exploit, especially externally available vulnerabilities, is increased tenfold. If you don't go with prioritization, you go with a 30-day timeline on a high, you could be owned on the second day. And that's why those timelines are so tight. And there is a lot of, griping on the internet about, these are very aggressive timelines. I think it is important to understand why that is. And that, this is not just to make your life harder. This is because your systems are under assault at a much higher frequency, with many more vulnerabilities on them, with the use of AI, both by attackers and researchers at the same time.
Yeah, and I don't even think they're that high, right? It's like some of them are high when it matters, but it's fairly relaxed when it doesn't, right? And so it does, I feel like this is a more realistic way of looking at vulnerability management. And I think something that folks have to realize is that there's so much vulnerability slop, just like AI slop on social media, right? There's a lot of vulnerability slop. AI finds a lot of vulnerabilities that either are never going to be worth exploiting, are not consistently exploitable, are not durably persistent. Like there's just a lot of junk out there. And this is going to help us cut through that in a way that CVSS scores wouldn't, right? CVSS scores is a useful starting point. It was never designed to be this reactive, smart system that could figure out whether or not a vulnerability was exploitable and go up or down. It was always all theoretical. And so now we've got to fill in the gaps as an industry to figure out how do we get people from the old way of just looking at a scan result, taking a rote 1, 2, or 3 level category vulnerability and running with it, and getting to something a little bit more granular.
Sam, from a technical perspective, what data has to exist before a provider can calculate that kind of rating consistently?
Well, I think that's the challenge, because it's not like you can say that every system will need the exact same data, and you can't say that they will get it from the exact same sources. I mean, you look at the cloud service provider community, and you have hyperscalers and you have single, very niche applications out there that serve the federal government. You at least need to know what type of data you have. You need to know what the impact of that data is, because we're putting vulnerabilities in the context of impact to the agency, right? You can't treat a system that has like a lunch menu the same as you treat something that has a large amount of HR data. Those have very different impacts to agencies. So, on top of your internal telemetry, which needs to capture that information, you need to work with your agencies and understand what their data is and what that value is to them. I think the communication issued by VA was very telling, because the CSP's implementation is part of a larger FISMA authorization, and they have a responsibility too, right? And so there is a partnership between it. So there is the technical part where you need to go in and say, where does this data sit? What kind of device is it on? What are the protections we have around that device? How many of these devices have this vulnerability? Things like that can be collected. But there's also this partnership of external data that you need to set the stage for the context of that data and its impact to the agency. So it's a technical problem with collecting all the telemetry, and then it's the communication challenges with the government to make sure you understand what the system means to them in their larger context, so you can properly talk about the impact to them if things are compromised.
Spence, VDR and VER become mandatory for all cloud services, whether they're obtaining or maintaining FedRAMP certification. So on December 7, right? What do I have to do now? What is my first step right away? And when is the absolute latest that I can put this off? Because I know that a lot of people are going to be like, I'll deal with it when the time comes. But like, it's August.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if it was me, I wouldn't be dealing with it till October, just because I'm lazy, right? But that's a bad approach. So this is a sea change. And so here's what I worry about. Here's kind of what I see with some clients. So GRC folks see this and they're like, okay, like this isn't that bad, right? Like on the surface, it doesn't seem that bad. And I don't necessarily know that all the GRC teams I work with are properly communicating to the security operations folks what this is going to entail, because I think the security operations people would sit there and tell the GRC folks, wait a minute, this is not only is this difficult technically, like this is a massive cultural change to everything that we do behind the compliance scene. So it's one of the things that we don't necessarily appreciate about with compliance. So like NIST 853, like whatever, like that's for most organizations, like they have to comply with NIST 853, but there is a whole parallel set of life that happens in other realms of security that are sort of adjacent to 853, might produce some supporting evidence, but exist outside those requirements. So like that big one is security operations centers, how they run. There are business level processes at the CISO level that exist differently. There are board reporting processes for vulnerability management that exist. And like this touches all of that. So like, for example, if you're in a public company and you have a quarterly process for communicating vulnerabilities up to the board, which is fairly common these days as boards have gotten involved in cybersecurity. Like there's no NIST control that covers that, but like that's about to get hammered, right? Like that's just about to get absolutely slaughtered for your federal stuff, because this is a completely different way of approaching this. So right now, I wouldn't wait until October. If I was a GRC person looking at this and having that mindset that like, oh, maybe that isn't that hard, I would call a meeting with your security operations folks, your product security people, all the other people that you work with that you're responsible for sort of shielding from compliance nonsense. And I would get them in a room, because like they can tell you all the different ways this is going to impact their life. And in a lot of ways, this is going to be organization specific. So different clients are going to have different challenges based on the sort of shadow and parallel processes they've stood up for compliance. But they really need to start having that conversation now. I know from my perspective, like just rolling out the data tagging would probably take me a month at a mid to large size organization. So work back from there, like that's November. And then you need another month probably to implement the technical solutions to automate some of this. So that's at least 2 months. So like maybe my October estimate's not so bad. But you've got essentially 6 weeks to sort of put your heads together with your people on your team to figure out how to really understand the technical implications of this and how it's going to mess up the way your teams do business right now behind the scenes. And then you got about a month and a half to 2 months to implement the technical solutions to get on board. Because again, it is a big cultural shift, and it's a big technical shift to how organizations are used to doing this.
And just to give people a context into how big of a shift this is, just really quickly, how different is this from the legacy monthly scanning and POAM process that Rev 5?
Yeah, totally different, right? So when we walk in we regularly do vulnerability reviews for companies. So companies will call us in to validate outside their 3PAO that they're processing vulnerabilities correctly, that they're reporting them accurately, that they're capturing all of them. We do these analyses all the time, right? They're relatively simple, right? We get a nice big chunk of vulnerabilities in high, medium, low. Like we track them against the SLAs. We can report, you had this number of assets that didn't report in on this month, so you missed them. So you had 20 SLA breaches. We do that kind of analysis all the time. Like that has just gotten infinitely complicated. So not only do you have to factor in the context of where an asset sits, like what asset the vulnerability sits on, you have to factor in whether or not that asset's publicly accessible. You have to factor in whether or not that vulnerability is actually exploitable, which is a lot harder than just looking at the KEV, right? Like I think that's, a lot of people are like, oh, well, we can just bounce this against the KEV and figure it out. Like, I think it's going to be more complicated than that. I think you can do a better job. Whether or not that's going to pass from a compliance perspective, we have yet to see. I don't think it should, but like there's a lot of analysis that goes in there. And then you have to have a way to tag all the different divergent SLAs you get, depending on how all those other things played out against those vulnerabilities, right? And so there is no way to do that in a manual process. Like if you think you're going to manually do this, like it's not going to happen. You need to automate it somehow. And so you're either going to need to buy a tool to do it, or you're going to need to start spinning up something fast internally, because it's not feasible to do this manually. Whereas POAM development, to your question, like we could do that manually all day long. Like it was a pain, right? But like I could write a little script that grabbed the highs and the mediums and the lows off the scan report and pop them into the POAMs and pre-populated all this stuff. Like that was easy, right? Pain, it was spreadsheet hand jamming. There was always a little bit of manual work that went in there, but that was straightforward. You can't do that anymore. Those scripts don't work.
Sam, from an operations standpoint, how would you describe this sort of provider that is probably not maybe like closest to being ready for VDR, VER, but maybe in a good place? What does that look like?
I mean, I think that's an interesting question, because you have to look at organizations and see what they were built for. I think you'll see commercial organizations who do security on highly sensitive information in a much better place, because they'll probably have some of the tooling, telemetry. There'll be a way to pull data in to meet these analysis timelines and these remediation timelines, because that's business, right? What has happened though is you've had compliance standards for a long time in federal government. And so a lot of times you're building to compliance standards. And so your operations team is building to what Spence was talking about, is building a spreadsheet. Oh, once a month I got to do this. Oh, and I need to get these deviation requests. So I need to like write these up so I can get an extended timeline and all of this other stuff. But if you have real world operational experience in a highly impacted environment, you probably have something adjacent to this, right? It might not be the exact requirements, but you at least understand the concepts. I think where to the converse of your question, where people are going to struggle who spent their whole time serving the federal government. I'm of the strong opinion that compliance does not equal security, right? And this is the closest that I think a compliance standard has really gone after security. Part of it's the landscape that I talked about earlier, but part of it's just like, this is a long, arduous manual process that doesn't really provide a lot of value, especially when you start talking 30 to 60 days delayed on vulnerability information to AOs who need to make authorization decisions, right? This is to give your AO that information very quickly. And so organizations that have had this 60-day timeline, these 30-day timelines in their head for delivery are going to really struggle. Whereas, agile organizations, I think people who are also companies that are also built on cloud native will have a much easier time getting the type of information they need, even though if they're not practicing it. So you have varying degrees. You have people who've been practicing this, organizations have been practicing this as a course of duty in business, and you're going to have organizations that have the pieces in place where it's going to be easier to put them together and put some logic behind the analysis. And then you're going to have some organizations that have spent their whole life in a spreadsheet when it comes to Kanban and kind of just do the thing that should happen for the government and don't have a real security operations focus.
Yeah, Sam's made a super important point, right? And I want to hammer on it. So the companies that are non-compliant with 853 are going to have a lot easier time than the ones that have built their culture around this. It is that much of a cultural change. So a great example are companies that have run automated CI/CD pipelines, which for the longest time, FedRAMP was just allergic to, right? We had massive fights over like the last 10 years trying to get the government to understand how modern CI/CD pipelines work and how that's actually, there are some security cons, but there are also a lot of security benefits. So organizations that run a really highly automated CI/CD pipeline have at least taken steps in the right direction, right? They know how to automatically find vulnerabilities. They know how to rate them against their own internal scoring metrics. They know how to fix things automatically pre-deployment. Like they're in a slightly better shape since VER and VDR like takes some of that culture and applies it to operational running systems. On the flip side, I'm not entirely sure how my heavily containerized clients are going to deal with this, just because containers have a habit of spawning really difficult to remediate vulnerabilities, right? So we're going to have some interesting discussions about what is and what is not actually exploitable in a container. But yeah, I mean, to Sam's point, like if you've lived government your whole life, like now is a time to try to do something else, because this is not the traditional government way of doing it. And it was a culture change for me personally. Like I had to adopt this mindset because, you know, this has been my life for a long time. I know Sam has talked about some of his personal struggles, not a pro or con on the framework, just like having to pull yourself out of this mindset and like adapt at our lovely old age when we're all getting ready to retire. And now we're having to, you know, rethink this whole new way of doing it. But it is that much of a change.
Sam, why does FedRAMP make such a big point about differentiating between mitigation and remediation? And what is the difference?
I mean, they make it because you have to be able to deal with vulnerabilities you can't close in the SLAs, right? So remediation means it's gone. You've applied the patch, you've changed the configuration set, you've done whatever you need to do to get rid of that vulnerability. It's no longer present. It just not there, right? Mitigation is where you put things around a vulnerability in different places to make sure that you lower the exploitability in the context of VDR and VER, right? That's a different game altogether. So if let's say you're running a multi-tenancy agency system that is handling HR data, right? If you get an N5 and there is no patch available, you can't just write a deviation request and say, hey, I need to extend this out because it's a vendor dependency. That doesn't exist anymore. What you need to do is you need to go into your system, look at your security context, and if it doesn't lower that to an acceptable rating in SLA when something's available to fix it, you need to add more security around it. You need to isolate those systems. You need to, it's been said in open forums from FedRAMP that you might need to take it offline until that's available if it is strong enough. Your incident response activates after very short periods of time, especially at the class D level, a little bit at the class C level. And so if you don't want to be running incident response activities all the time, you're going to have to learn how to do some mitigation for these things, or you're just going to spend a lot of time, filling out paperwork. And I think that's probably honestly by design. Like FedRAMP and any government customer, not just FedRAMP, but government customers would much prefer that you not do a bunch of paperwork, that you actually go into your system and make it harder for these vulnerabilities to be exploited than just creating massive amounts of paper trails. And the pain will get great for some of these systems that don't kind of thread the needle on this. I've seen several ideas about implementations, and some are, we're taking this high watermark where everything could potentially be an N4 and N5. That's a very dangerous thing to do because you've got to get those mitigations in place, or you got to activate your IR, or you've got to do a whole bunch of other stuff. You need to look at these automations for this evaluation and make sure that you're tuning. And I think to Spence's point that people will be able to stand something up and it might pass, and they might say, okay, Kev's okay for right now, or EPSS is okay for right now. But you're going to have to tune these things as you go, as you see what works and doesn't work, so that you're getting the most accurate representation of that risk to the government. And if you're getting tons of N4s and N5s every, whatever it is, 3 to 4 days that you're scanning, you might have to make security changes inside your network for mitigations that happen automatically instead of reacting every single time one of these pops up. So I think, it's a little beyond the scope of your question, but those are two different things. Remediation's relatively easy aside from testing. You just patch the thing, change the setting, but mitigation becomes a very serious issue, especially at your higher pain levels, right? And so, that is going to change things like your architecture. It is going to require intervention, could be, taking things offline, and you might need to start using your incident response procedures way more than you probably ever have before. So yeah, it is a big deal, and the differentiation does matter.
And that's another great point. So there is not a single IR control in NIST 853 that makes you good at incident response. There just isn't, right? Like at best, they create a framework for organizations to execute effectively, but there's no control that you can point to and be like, simply by following this control, I'm good at incident response. And so one of the things we note is that most of the 853 compliant groups we work with, whether that's FedRAMP, whether that's DoD, whether that's just agency civilian, they're terrible at incident response, like because they don't do it, right? They go to an alternate team in their company that's read into the federal program and can do incident response for them, or they have a third party that is approved that does incident response for them because they suck at it, right? And so they're going to not be able to do that anymore. Like instead of having this whole big control set of incident response controls that makes you walk through and have a plan and like have these structured meetings and create these tickets, right? They're just going to have to get good at it because they're going to have to do it all the time if they're popping out 4s and 5s. And that's kind of one of the things I like about FedRAMP 20x, rather than set aside all these controls that like, might create an environment where it works better, but probably doesn't, at least not the way most people implement it. Like you just have to get good at it, because if you suck at it, like it's not going to work, right? Like you don't have a choice but to get good at it. I think that's just a well-designed compliance program, but it is going to be a huge change. So if you're one of our mid-sized clients, that mid-sized to large clients that looks to corporate for your IR, guess what? They're going to want nothing to do with you when you are streaming them 4s and 5s to say, oh, we have to treat this like an incident. Yeah, like people's heads are going to roll because that team's going to come kick your butt. They don't want to deal with that. So you're either going to tighten up internally or you're going to figure out how to do it internally. And it's going to be interesting to watch.
Spence, what does it mean for a vulnerability to be accepted? What is an accepted vulnerability?
Actually, I don't know. I have no idea. Is there a formal definition, Sam, for that in FedRAMP 20x?
Yeah, so there is a requirement that after a certain amount of days, it becomes automatically accepted. And with that,
got it.
Yeah. Like there's a form, there's a JSON format. It's reportable. You got to get explanations as to why it's okay. It's a huge pain. So
I got it. So risk acceptance. So this is something that's not going to be relatively new to FedRAMP. So commercial organizations that were diving into FedRAMP, one of the biggest culture changes they had is that all of a sudden they weren't in charge of their own risk acceptances, because you kind of couldn't do it. You kind of sort of could, but you couldn't really do it in old Rev 5 FedRAMP. You couldn't just say, we're accepting this risk, which private sector companies do all the time. They might have a high vulnerability that's exploitable in a public space, and they're like, man, we're not going to deal with it. Like 3 members of the executive team are signing off that we're accepting this, right? FedRAMP finally makes that an option, which is good, but also piles some requirements on it under 20x to make that meaningful. And I think that's a good move, because it aligns with commercial practice, but it also matures corporate practice, because most commercial organizations are just way too flippant with vulnerability acceptances. What happens is they pile up 1,500 high vulnerabilities, they can't deal with it, and they just blanket risk accept everything because they don't know what to do. And FedRAMP doesn't let you do that anymore, but it does have a risk acceptance process that at least aligns with what the commercial sector at least should be doing.
So now I want to talk about how to actually make this happen, how to operationalize it, right? So Spence, VDR can fail even when tooling exists. Mm-hmm. Where does the operating model usually break down?
I think the operating model is going to break down in automation. So if you need to have a system that this needs to be hands-off, right? Like your vulnerability scanner needs to be able to speak to some tool that you've either purchased or you built on your own. What I think we've been building our own now for 6 months. So if you're going to build your own, I would caution you that it is much harder than you think going in, because it was hard for us. We've finally gotten there, but man, was that a mountain to climb. But like, that's always an option, right? If you could always try to build your own or buy one, but you need to have some processing logic that hits all of this, so that what the output is clear to stakeholders, because you're going to drive yourself nuts trying to map like pain levels to vulnerabilities. Like, it needs to spit out, and it needs to be logic that you're comfortable with, that you can defend to an auditor, and that you can defend to an agency. I think that's where, if you have that figured out, the operating model is not much different, right? You fix these vulnerabilities on these timetables, that you can execute to that if you figured out that automation piece. And that's where some effort needs to go into, is figuring out that automation piece. But it is going to be tricky for organizations that aren't used to thinking about data flows. Like, where does federal data actually live? Where does it not live? What type of data is here and there? That'll be interesting for people to figure out. But once you've made that investment, like, it doesn't usually change that much. And it can be a nice input to this automated process that you're going to build, because you don't have a choice.
Yeah, and I like that question, because I've been thinking about this a lot. So the first thing, I think, Spence touched on it without calling out by name, is really, doing your math first so you know what you're actually monitoring, right? Will help a lot. Like, so organizations looking at the right stuff, I'm a fan of math because we're not just looking at random systems, so that lessens your burden. It also has you concentrate on those flows and those data types that Spence was talking about. Like, that particular exercise shapes up well into VDR and VER. I think that's a great place to start. The other thing I was thinking is, Spence alluded to, we've been building, and me, Spence, and some other folks sat in a room and hammered out this equation, and we really liked it. And then we started getting serious about operationalizing it, and we were talking to our architect about it, and we got to the point where we said, here are the concepts, right? Here are the things we need to prove out. How can you programmatically prove this? And what's interesting is that, FedRAMP 20x came out, and I know VDR and VER are not just 20x, they're Rev 5 too, but I put it in that frame because that's how I think about it. But one of the interesting things that happens is when it first came out, I was like, this is engineers running the show. And what we found out, what has worked best, is we have a bunch of old-time risk managers, compliance people, security people sit around and come up with ideas. And then we're working with engineering saying, look, these are the concepts we need in here. Here's the type of information we need to derive. Here's what we're getting to. And then having them go back and work through iterations worked really well for us. Like, our first equation was, okay, it's serviceable, it would probably pass, the VER standards. But what we've come up recently is better because we took that shared view, right? It wasn't an engineer sitting by themselves thinking about stuff, and it wasn't a bunch of old compliance people thinking about stuff. It was really marrying that stuff together. And overall, the more I've dealt with 20x, not just VDR, VER, is it really is that relationship that Spence has alluded to throughout this entire time. Is it really takes security operations, risk managers, executives have to get together and think about, how do we think about this stuff? What is important to us? What's important to our customers? How do we contextualize all that kind of stuff? And it's hit me recently, given our current activities on our product, just how much my view has changed about where this lands. And it really does, it isn't compliance in charge anymore. It is the organization as a whole in charge of this, with ownership in multiple parts of this thing. And I think, as we've talked about this, that it's not a cultural change, but it's a different way to look at a problem, not giving it to this one group that sits off and takes care of your federal stuff, and they come and give you a budget and you give them what they ask for, and then it goes away. This is, everybody has a stake in this now. And to get real solutions takes that kind of coordination, and I think that's some of the complication that gets lost in a lot of the talk out there, is that it really, there are so many more stakeholders that need to be involved and are involved now. And I just think it's been an interesting learning experience for me over the last 6 months, trying to solve this problem with other folks in the company.
Yeah, and actually, I need to amend my timeline because I forgot the whole whatever you come up with at first is not going to work part of the development process, because you are coming up with it. You're coming up with an equation, like it's almost deterministic. It's like these categories here meet this, and then this is the score, right? And so the first time you deploy it, like your scores are going to be all out of whack because you didn't get it right in a vacuum, because no one can, right? So you need to give yourself at least 2 or 3 weeks of tuning time on this solution once you get it deployed, because it's not going to work out of the box.
I love how what we're seeing in a lot of discussions right now really feels like the discussion around VDR gets flattened into, oh, it's automated now, everything's automatic and things like that. But I was about to ask the question of, where in this does human judgment still come in? But Sam, you were really explaining it earlier, in that the way you designed the logic of all of it and everybody needing to be involved here. And that's how you build the automation. And that's where human judgment comes in.
Yeah. And there's always a place for human judgment here, right? So like, I'm going to, if I were a CISO and I got my, cool Northwatch report out of the 38 Northwatch system of where our vulnerabilities were and which ones, were important. Like there's always an opportunity to say, I disagree on this one. Let me document on these 3 or 4, like why I think my countermeasures are in place, or why I think, this is actually mitigated in this environment. Like there's still opportunity for vulnerability analysts to do that. It's just, they can't do it for everything, right? So it's like, we need automation to take care of 95% of it so that the human intelligence can focus on the 5% that remains, which again, like that's good vulnerability management. And it wasn't the case with old FedRAMP. Old FedRAMP, it was like human intelligence was spread across 100% and everyone just wanted to give up and like go raise goats, right? So now we're going to build this automation system that gets us 95% so that like I can be laser focused on these weird edge cases or these, you know, odd vulnerabilities, or maybe a vulnerability in a custom piece of software that I wrote that's like difficult to deal with. Like I can focus on those and have automation take care of the rest. But anyone who's built automated systems before knows like there's a whole ton of work that goes into getting that to work. Once it works, it can be great, right? But like there is so much blood, sweat, and tears that goes into automating this. And this is no different, which is why, you know, clock's ticking there. And folks need to get moving.
Internally, who owns this now?
Well, to Sam's point, like I don't know that you can say that anymore. Like before, it was so FedRAMP and NIST 853 are so weird that you could stand up a team that was like, go figure this out and tap corporate only when you need to. And FedRAMP sort of supported that because they were really strict about where corporate could be involved or not. So like it encouraged these ecosystems that were isolated from everything else. And, you know, most modern scalable security teams don't work like that. Like security engineering, GRC, product dev, like they tend to be pretty tight and oftentimes operated under one unit. But like FedRAMP sort of atomized that under the old model. And now I don't know that you can say that anybody owns it. I think it's going to be a real joint effort across GRC, security ops, security engineering, product security, maybe IT for automation, depending on how automation works in your organization. Like it's going to be very organization dependent. We no longer, the federal compliance programs no longer dictate what your organization needs to look like. We just say, you know, you need to report this data and you know, realistically need to automate it to get to this. And then how you do it behind the scenes, like you guys figure it out in the way that's most optimum for you.
And that's really what's behind, you know, what the PMO has been saying is that FedRAMP is no longer a compliance program. It is now security. So what did we learn today, folks? VDR is all about making vulnerability decisions visible, timely, and defensible. FedRAMP is asking providers to do more than detect findings and report them on a schedule. Providers now need to evaluate vulnerabilities in the context of the actual system, understand potential agency impact, prioritize response, track mitigation and remediation, and maintain reporting that agencies and assessors can rely on. For existing Rev 5 providers, again, this is no longer theoretical. Everybody has a deadline of December 7th, 2026. That is when VDR and VER become mandatory. And a little bit of self-promotion here. That is the problem that the VDR component of Northwatch was built to help solve. Your scanners will find the vulnerabilities, but Northwatch helps determine which ones matter, what response timeframe applies, and how that decision is tracked from discovery through mitigation, remediation, or acceptance. If you are not sure whether your current vulnerability program can support VDR and VER, now is the time to find out. We would love to talk to you. Let's have a conversation. Reach out to us. Sam and Spence, thank you once again for joining me today.
It's a pleasure.
Our pleasure.
Awesome. And everybody, for more discussions about FedRAMP 20x, VDR, VER, and continuous validation, follow the series or visit 38northsecurity.com.